From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. The man who saved AIG after the financial crash and against all odds paid back the U.S. the full $182 billion government bailout plus interest, one of the great business turnarounds in American history. That's today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Bob Benmosche was CEO of AIG from 2009 to 2014, literally saving the company from bankruptcy and dismantlement, enabling it to repay debts to the government within 3 years. And prior to AIG, he was the CEO of MetLife for 8 years. Also a top executive at Payne Webber and Chase Manhattan Bank, tragically passing away in February of 2015. We're joined today in his honor by Bob's son, Ari Benmosche. He was a vice president of investments at AIG. And we're also joined by the co-author, Peter Marks, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and from our flagship station, Yale Radio. He's an honors graduate of Yale. The book is Good for the Money, My Fight to Pay Back America. Welcome, Ari and Peter.
Thank you, Jim.
Great to have you guys on board. I'm going to start with Ari. It's almost as if he sacrificed his life for this, the intensity, the dedication, the focus. He also, in dealing with all the constituencies, Treasury, White House, Fed, other executives at AIG, seemed to, in many cases, piss people off, be a contrarian. Tell us a little bit about the person and how he thrived in this environment.
I guess to answer the first part of your question, he was always about what his legacy was, and his legacy was extremely important to him. So in that sense, he was willing to devote the rest of his life to it, and that's actually what he did. As far as all the various constituents, he was very outspoken on what leaders normally do, which is what they thought it was right, and if people disagreed with his position, he'd let them know. And he'd do it his way because he knew he had to lead a great organization. So I think in that sense, he ruffled a lot of feathers. And at the same time, because he was willing to stand up to what he believed in, which was the people of AIG aren't the villains here in this story, it really changed morale around at the company.
Peter, tell us briefly, A, how you became involved in this project, writing the book, and B, set the stage a little bit, the government ownership share, the Fed lend. Just give us perspective on the whole thing.
Well, I got involved, Jim, actually through my wife, who worked for Bob and had written some of his internal speeches and memos to the staff, and he had asked her to help him with the memoir, and I, through Val, sort of signed on. I became part of that. I'm a reporter and for the Washington Post, and so we became a team, the three of us. And the background is that AIG was in the midst of this whirlwind back during the financial crisis, got into tremendous trouble in the subprime mortgage market, owing, way more money that it could pay back, and was basically on its hands and knees to the government, needing some kind of infusion of bailout money, or it would have sunk, and potentially the economy with it. It just had that huge a stake in what was going on. It got way beyond insurance. Remember, AIG was an insurance company, but it became very involved in financial products of all kinds, as did many other companies on the margins of the financial markets. And as things evolved, both the Fed and the Treasury participated in this massive rescue effort. The Treasury became essentially the owner of AIG. They owned about 80% of the stock, and the Fed was its banker, the only people that would lend it money. And this, was to the tune of, nearly $200 billion. So it was a huge stake for this company. And may I say, Jim, no one had an expectation when this all started that AIG would pay it back. Maybe some small portion, And the idea at the beginning was, well, we'll just sell off bits and pieces of this company, get whatever we can, like we're at a flea market, and at the end of the day, we'll absorb the losses and move on. That was kind of the mindset when this all started, when Bob entered the picture and turned everything around.
I was going to ask you, go to that from Ari, which I find fascinating, which is Bob was not a liquidator, just as Peter was saying, that this Project Destiny, which was on the table, was just sell everything as fast as you can as a fire sale. I'm intrigued that he was brought in when his approach was going to be different than everybody's, from the government to his own board. Did they know that, and how was he able to sell it?
Well, the first thing that he would say when he was here is, when he was approached by Uncle Sam, he did his due diligence. Like everybody does when they're going to look for a job. You find out who you're working for. You want to know who the decision makers are, and you really want to know what plan they had for the company. And one of, I think, the key conversations he had was with Jim Milstein, and he was the restructuring officer on behalf of the United States Treasury. He was an investment banker. That was his background, and he was an expert at corporate restructurings. And he sat down with Jim, and Jim really laid out where he thought the restructuring would be and what the strategy was. And at the end of that conversation, my father said to him, well, look, you seem to have a good handle on things. Why don't you run the company? And his reply was that he's really not a manager of people. He knows how to get it done, but he's not a manager of people. And that's where my father was tremendously successful. So I think those two guys believed that there was a value, underlying value in the companies. I think there were a lot of people that didn't think that there were. And, you talk about not being a liquidator. One of his famous phrases was, I'm not a liquidator. I don't liquidate things. I build them. And he felt from being at MetLife that there was that it was really market conditions at the time which created these depressed values. And he thought there was tremendous untapped value not only in the underlying companies but in the people that were demonized in the press. And if he could get everyone to stop putting their heads down and thinking, woe is me, and getting back to work and increasing productivity, that you're really going to have tremendous value untapped. And he was a huge believer in that, one of the few.
All right, let me ask you this, Ari, that obviously the thing that AIG became hated for after a while was this $165 million of bonuses that were paid to the Financial Products Group, that small group of people right near here in Wilton, to make sure they stayed on board because they'd written all these credit default swaps that they couldn't honor. And they also, the stock loan piece of it, they'd sort of mismatched assets and liabilities, which to me would put me on the side of these guys shouldn't have been given the bonuses. Your father was very strongly supportive of the employees and even the folks in financial products. How do you explain that? Well,
I think the first comment, his belief was a contract is a contract. And these contracts were put in place as retention bonuses for people that didn't cause the issue. But I think Peter might be able to help me out with the number. I think it's like out of 11,000 or so trades, only about 122 were bad.
Just about.
So it gives you a sense of the scale. Right. So you have sort of the smartest guys in the room that are sitting here trying to unwind all of this risk that the company took on. So how do you do that? And you're worried about the $165 million in bonuses, but this is a rounded figure to give you a sense. Had those people not been there, and let's say they all just jumped ship, and you couldn't keep them there working, or had they wound it down faster, Project Destiny's plan, or the plan of the company before he got there, was to unwind these, get out of the Financial Products Group at a rapid pace, they would have taken a $20 to $25 billion loss on the trades. And with these people staying at their desk and doing things the right way, and my father negotiating time with the United States government to be able to take that time to be able to unwind these and really understand what's on the books, I think the number was closer to a $4 billion loss. So with the payback, there was a profit of $22.7 billion back to the American taxpayer. You could argue that was it right there.
In fact, with the final seconds of this segment, Peter, do people even realize generally that AIG paid back all the money?
Well, it's gotten lost in time, basically, in the fog of financial war. So they tried to make the case, but there was such a huge amount of negative publicity around this company that I don't think it ever will completely escape the smell of that period. So no, I think the answer is no.
Listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the Internet, access our podcast. We'll look a little bit back at Bob Benmosche's formative years coming up in segment 2. And our guests are Ari Benmosche, the son of Bob Benmosche, the former CEO of AIG, and journalist, Washington Post staff reporter, Peter Marks. Ari, your father took on burdens at a very young age, talked about the pressure of managing debt as young as 10 years old, losing his father at a young age. Give us a sense of where this came from.
So if you can imagine, being 10 years old and losing your father, and his mother was left with 4 kids, a motel that was 2 businesses. They had a restaurant and some cabins, and then a motel that my grandfather just built and had $250,000 in debt. And this was in 1954, and died without a will and died without any life insurance. So, he was brought up at a very young age to roll up his sleeves and go to work. And, that's all really owed to my grandmother, Lillian Benmosche, who really had tremendous amount of integrity and drive and discipline. And this was all up in the small towns of the Catskills in Monticello, New York. So he learned at a very young age that, this is the hand you're dealt. And when you're dealt that hand, you just have to learn how to play it. And he taught us, my sister and I, as we were growing up, those same values that he learned as a young kid.
And your mom was not only tough, but she was a tough sales lady, too. She would tell them at like age 10 or 11, give them the pen to get people to sign up to get a room.
Yeah, it was a story of him working at the front desk, and the people would come in and say, do you have a room? And they say, yes, we have vacancies. And she would say, no, son, you did that all wrong. You have to give them the pen and give them the registration card before you say anything else. And it was a sales pitch of you have to have them help you make the sale, because once people are given that pen, once they're holding the pen in the hand, you don't even tell them the rate until they ask. So she was just a wealth of those kinds of knowledge, and you would think it's kind of common sense knowledge, but I really think it's something that can be learned and taught.
And I guess delving a little bit into the psychology of this, having suffered the loss of a parent, he had a complex personal life as an adult, and it struck me particularly because Warren Buffett is my business hero, who also had a complex life. He didn't get divorced from his wife, Susie, but she moved to San Francisco, and he ended up with another woman while he never got divorced. And your dad did kind of the same thing.
Yeah, he did. My sister, put it best once. She said, my dad, didn't. Usually when you have a relationship and then you leave that relationship, whether it be girlfriend or whatever, throughout your life, you end that relationship and you move to the other. And
mm-hmm.
She always felt that he sort of had this collection of he never really left his feelings for the other person behind, and he was like that with every person he met. But the key here is as he told everyone, and also to Peter, he always said he wasn't a saint, and he never claimed to be a saint. And I think that's what made him a terrific leader for a large organization of people, because he wasn't someone who was sitting in his ivory tower pretending to be perfect.
Mm-hmm. And from your and your sister's perspective, you respected your mother's whole handling of the whole thing and staying with it and all that?
Yeah, I think it's not as black and white as you paint it.
Okay.
I think things were off and on, and love is love.
Yeah.
I think that's the best way to put it.
It works. It worked for Buffett, and there's a lot of loyalty there too. And I know in Buffett's approach. Peter, let me ask you this: he grew MetLife as CEO from $11 billion to $40 billion. In a nutshell, why was he so successful at MetLife, and why was he such a successful growth CEO?
Well, he knew how to. In terms of it bled over to AIG. He knew how to motivate people. He really oversaw the transformation of the sales staff and made it a powerful part of the company. It had been a very lackadaisical, gentlemanly kind of company before Bob came in, and he oversaw not only this sort of new muscularity in the approach, he also presided over the demutualization of the company, which was a huge transformation for this very genteel organization. And he was the kind of guy, and if I read hundreds of reports, one of those 360 reports they did about him by an outside company to find out his leadership style.
Interesting.
And he was a hands-on guy. He was the guy who he would talk to everybody in the field and in the office. He was just that hands-on.
And when he first got to MetLife, it was about an $11 billion company, market cap. And when he left, it was $40 billion. And how did he do that? And it was always he always had this phrase at MetLife, take off the collar, which really means give people the courage to take risk. And he always believed that if you give people the freedom to act and they exercise that freedom responsibly, it's amazing that what can be achieved.
So he goes to AIG, which to me always tremendous guts, because I know AIG was like 200 operating units that only Hank Greenberg knew what the heck was going on, right? Mm-hmm. How did he get it? How did he get his arms around it?
You want me to answer that? So, yeah, he believed that, look, Hank Greenberg grew this company over a 35-year period. They had a CEO of CEOs within the organization. There was a roadmap of where the company should be, and that was really what my father's vision was, and he had to make sure that the board was aligned with his vision, that at the end of the day, this is going to be an insurance, a global property casualty insurer, and a large domestic life insurer with other life insurance companies in certain parts of the country. So that was his vision. So he always knew that the outer companies were going to have to be sold off. He was going to get out of ILFC, the aircraft leasing business. But what you have to do in any leadership role like this, especially in times of crisis, is you have to have vision, and then you need to be decisive. That's what he did.
And you're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We are taking a break now, and then when we come back, we'll talk about paying back America. And we're back. Bob Benmosche, the former CEO of AIG's book, Good for the Money, My Fight to Pay Back America. All right, I want to start with you on this one, and we've sort of gotten around this a little bit, but there were 5 CEOs in the 5 years before he came on board. They were obviously ineffective or failed. Ed Liddy was the one before from Allstate, and I don't know whether he was the wrong guy in your mind or too nice of a guy. But I kind of, how do you become the successful CEO after 5 have gone by the wayside?
Well, people, would say to my father, look, it was Hank Greenberg, a legend, and you had Martin Sullivan, Robert Willemstad, Ed Liddy. Ed Liddy, it's in the depths of the crisis, he's taking the job for $1. Everyone thinks America's not going to get paid back. You got nothing to lose. You have no downside. And he would say, I have tremendous downside. I have my own reputation. So that's my most valuable asset. So he had a lot to lose. The first thing he did was he went up to Financial Products to actually speak with the people in that organization.
Which no one had done, apparently.
No one did it. I mean, and it was mind-boggling to him. The other thing he did was he actually spoke, God forbid, to Hank Greenberg. I mean, God forbid he should talk. And they had a very good relationship from when he was at MetLife, and Hank actually recommended my father for the position. So he had a lot to do with my dad being there. But look, he was not going to sit around and lock himself up in an office and try and financially dismantle this company. He had a town hall style leadership model, which was really getting out to the front lines, skipping middle management, skipping senior management, and speaking with the people on what the actual issues are, and then resolve them one by one.
How is it that he was able? It was a very siloed company. That he was able to A, break through that, and B, to understand it.
That really goes out to Peter Hancock, because if you recall, that's what he joined the company as, which was the chief risk officer of the company. And really, how do you understand how each business unit, with the decisions and the businesses that they're in, affect other parts of the organization? And Peter was instrumental in breaking down these silos and really having each group understand how they're impacting others. So I would say a lot goes out to Peter for really digging in and understanding how each piece fits.
Is it your feeling that AIG could not have survived without your father?
They needed someone at the time after the congressional hearing for Ed Liddy, and I don't know if you know this, Jim. My father said yes the first time. There was an investment banker at Goldman Sachs, Chris Cole, who did a lot of work for insurance companies that called my father. I remember being in the kitchen when he got the call and was speaking with Chris about the opportunity, and he said yes. I told him to say yes. He said yes the first time, but I think with the Paulson contact with Ed Liddy and Goldman Sachs, he took the job. And look, if my father didn't take it the second time, and certainly with how Ed Liddy was treated by our government officials, I think the list was very short.
And by the way, your dad didn't seem to want to work for $1 a year.
Look, yeah, it's a message, and everything he did was strategic. Executive compensation didn't cause the financial crisis, despite what public anger said otherwise. So in fact, he knew that you needed talented people in the organization.
That's a good point. It's an interesting point you just made that I want to follow up on, which is that he threatened to resign a lot. The chairman said he was volatile, maybe too erratic. Was there some of what I would call the Nixon madman strategy to this, which is, trying to make it seem like you might be crazy to get your points through and to get stuff done?
I think to the layman, it may seem that what he was doing was crazy. His decisions were crazy. But look, you have to put it in context that if if they didn't pay him fair compensation, and if he wasn't going to be given the freedom to do his job the way he needed to, like I said earlier, his reputation was his most valuable asset, and he wasn't going to sit there and let someone bring him down because the visions aren't aligned collectively. So, I don't think I think if he didn't get what was promised to him in the beginning, you have to do your due diligence and know how the table is set that you're about to sit down at. He would have left. I think it worked for him, and people might say he was incredibly intelligent in masterful negotiations. But look, he was serious, and people took him seriously all the time.
I like one of the lines he says to some of the executives we don't think are fully on board, saying, I know you think I'm going to blow up, but it's not going to happen as fast as you think, so you better get on board now.
I love that.
It's a great line. Peter, let me ask you now, there were a lot of myths that you would have assumed would have been truisms, that there would have been huge turnover, that all the good people would have left, that the customers would have left, that they sold off crown jewels, nothing was left. Were those all myths? It ended up ended up not being the case.
Well, it wasn't so much that that they weren't going to sell off some of the crown jewels. What Bob's genius was that he understood intrinsically, almost magically, I think, the value of things. He knew when to sell them. So there were plans to sell off some of the big pieces of the company that actually did get sold off. It's just that when he waited till the markets recovered and there was actually a moment when it made sense to sell them. It wasn't a panic. And it goes back to your very first question, Jim, about why Bob and what he was bringing to the table. One of the most important things that Jim Milstein wanted him to do was to stand up to everybody else in the process. Milstein, the restructuring guy, understood that this company was being torn apart, both from inside and outside, and he needed someone who could stand up both to what was going on there and to what was said about this company in Congress. And Bob was the guy. And you asked Ari, would this company exist if it weren't for Bob? I say no, it would not exist if it weren't for Bob Benmosche.
Let me ask both of you, and obviously for Ari it's personal, for Peter it's a corporate governance issue. He gets cancer, but this guy decides that neither he or the board will release the exact details, sort of reminding me of Steve Jobs. Now that raises governance issues, but it also allowed him to keep his credibility. How do you guys come down on all that?
Ari?
Yeah, sure. Look, it's, he said, are you my doctor? If you're not my doctor and you're not treating me, what do you need to know what kind of cancer I have? You need to know that I have cancer. You need to know that my short-term prognosis is good. And if that changes, we need to do something. So he needed to speak to the board to make sure that they had a contingency plan in place. And also, they need to start working on a succession plan further down the road. And
I think it's important to say, he also thought the day that he said lung cancer, he'd be finished. They would write him off and they would just count the days. That was his thought. The interesting question, Jim, is, in this day and age, how transparent does a company have to be? How much does the CEO owe his shareholders? Amazingly, and in my mind, it's a stunning part of the story, no one ever pushed him. No one in the financial press ever forced him. Once he said, I'm not saying, everybody shut up, which is really interesting given that it's a fairly aggressive press. I was kind of surprised that didn't happen.
But he would also say, look, I'm not going to tell you because the last thing I need is my children to read in the papers that I'm going to lose an arm, or that because some expert says this is going to happen to me, or what's going to happen to me is going to happen to me, and I think AIG during that period of time really wrote somewhat of the playbook on what should be disclosed and what shouldn't have to be disclosed.
And you're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC and WGCH, Greenwich, Connecticut. At our last national segment coming up, we'll look back at the AIG story. Our guests, Ari Benmosche and Peter Marks. We're talking about Ari's dad, Bob Benmosche of AIG. I want to just finish up on the governance issue in two ways, first with Ari and then Peter. The first one is, Ari, you got to describe to us or give us some of the color behind the epic battle, which is really amazing, between the CEO, Bob Benmosche, and the chairman, Harvey Golub, at AIG.
If you asked my dad after he got in there, if he'd known what he'd known, would he have taken the job? Mm-hmm. And his answer would have been no. He worked with Dennis Stammerman, who was on the board at that time and also has passed away, and he had to leave the board early on. And he was really an advocate for my father back when he worked at GE, and my dad was at Payne Weber during the Kidder-Peabody merger. So if my dad knew how misaligned the board was on his vision, he wouldn't be able to achieve what he achieved. And he found that in Harvey. I think Harvey felt that AIG should be broken up, and my father felt that the whole was worth more than the parts. He felt undermined. He felt undermined with the executive group. And then after it really came down to the Prudential UK, which is not affiliated with the U.S. Prudential deal, where he was voted down with a lower price change. And after that, it became really, really bad. And my father said, look, I can't work this way. It's either you or me. And it came down to this boardroom showdown, as you say. And it's like you can't make this up in the movies. Yeah. And you have at the end of the day Morris Offit, who was one of the board members at the time. After Harvey went into they were both asked to leave. Harvey says, look, Bob, we need to work on a relationship. And my dad said, Harvey, we don't have a relationship. And then he storms off and leaves and actually goes back into the boardroom to try and plead that Bob needs to leave. And Morris, whom my father thought wasn't an advocate for him, said, look, Harvey, it's easier to replace a chairman than it is a CEO. You have to go. And he eventually resigned. And from that moment on, it was, if you think of a graph, it was just an upward trend. I mean, everyone was aligned. The board was aligned. Steve Miller was a terrific chairman. And it really freed up a lot of tension in the organization because you were aligned with the leadership's vision.
The guts and the courage also that amazed me is that Harvey comes in during this and says, maybe we should get along. And your dad refused at that point to bend because he knew it wasn't going to happen.
What is he going to work on it for 3 months, and then it's going to be back to the same old? Look, I remember him telling me that, he envisioned, because he was a Florida resident, and Harvey, I believe, was Florida also, that they might have a small satellite office there and collaborate and work on things.
A big part of the psychology appears to be to use FU money that your dad felt he had. That was sort of like his blanket, right, all the time.
I mean, he always said to me, when you wear wet shoes, you never want to put on those wet shoes again. So growing up the way he did, money was very important to him, and not having any debts was very important to him when your whole family is saddled by it.
Peter, briefly, on the governance issue, where do you come down on whether the chairman of the board and the CEO should be separate positions, especially in light of what we've just been talking about?
Well, there was no history of this being separate at AIG. Right. It was almost an experiment, and I think that the problem was there was no time for these guys to define their roles. They both came in almost at the same time. They had very, vague notions of how they were going to split it up. Bob thought that Harvey was going to be the front man for what was happening in Washington. He didn't want to have to deal with those people, but Harvey had a completely different vision of what he was doing. I think it was a huge mistake to have gone into that. It caused a tremendous amount of extra turmoil in this organization. And I think it distracted Bob, if anything, from he spent a lot of time his first year dealing with the mishigas, as we say, of this problem. So it was a miscalculation, and it was, fortunately rectified because Bob was a singular CEO. He was a force of nature, and everyone recognized it.
When the shareholders were going after Jamie Dimon, I remember my father getting on the TV and saying, look, there's no we in CEO.
There was a lot of controversy, and it bothered me that, a big chunk of that bailout, what people may not realize, was to actually provide collateral to the counterparties. Goldman Sachs, for instance, got $13 billion. So it made AIG look bad. It looked like a backdoor because they took the blame. Should there have been haircuts there, and should these guys like Goldman not have gotten 100%?
Absolutely. And Bob was more outraged than anybody.
Yeah.
He saw this happening. It infuriated him that they were being paid off 100 cents on the dollar. In fact, his idea at the very beginning, his first notion, and Ari can back me up, his idea was nobody gets paid back until we start to sort this thing out. So, he called them vultures. Yeah. And it was hundreds of millions of dollars that was going out the door when he was watching, the people at Financial Products be vilified, be followed home from work, be harassed, have their children at school threatened. So, he felt this world was topsy-turvy, upside down completely.
What he said was, look, they absolutely shouldn't have been given 100 cents on the dollar with these collateral agreements. I would say the one person who couldn't stand it more was Hank Greenberg, and then my father for a lot of reasons. But look, what he did commend the government for doing is being decisive in taking action.
And I must say it didn't look good either because Hank Paulson was Secretary of Treasury and Goldman Sachs got bailed out through the back door.
Yes. Yeah, the optics were as bad as you can get them. But look, Bernanke and Paulson put their heads together and actually did something. Everyone can look back and say it should have been different. What he did give him a thumbs down for, and that's for the United States government, is once our economy started improving and things were better, and the rating agencies got better handle on companies and how much capital they have, they were too scared to tell people.
Well, it's been a very quick hour, and really it comes down to the fact that Bob Benmosche was really an American hero here, not only helping avoid the country's economic financial system collapsing, but also doing this while he was fighting with cancer that he knew was fatal. It's a $60 billion company. He did $205 billion of transactions, turned, as was mentioned earlier, a $23 billion profit to the government on the $182 billion of bailout money. It's pretty amazing, under 3 years, too. Thanks to Ari Benmosche, Peter Marks. The book, again, is Good for the Money, My Fight to Pay Back America. It's written with Valerie Wendy, who's AIG's head of corporate citizenship that was mentioned, published by St. Martin's. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Podcasts available on iTunes. You can subscribe to them. Thanks to Ari Benmosche, Peter Marks. Thanks to our national audience for listening. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. The man whose name is on the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill, the most ambitious reform of the financial system since the Depression-era reforms under FDR, and the first member of Congress to have an openly same-sex relationship and a leader in the LBGT civil rights movement. That's Barney Frank. He represented the 4th Congressional District in Massachusetts for over 3 decades and chaired the House Financial Services Committee from 2007 to 2011. During the financial crash and the aftermath of the near global financial collapse. His new book, Frank, A Life in Politics from the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. Welcome, Congressman. An honor to have you here. And as you say in your book, when you started, it was the era of progressive big government, and same-sex marriage would have been considered heresy. Now here we are, 50 years later, and same-sex marriage increasingly is becoming accepted in America, but the era of big government seems to be over. Things have reversed. What do you think about that?
I still think being gay would keep you from getting elected president, but I don't think there's any other office in much of the country where it would keep you out. On the other hand, getting into government today and over the last few years has meant less than I had hoped it would, because there is this attitude that government's a bad thing, which I disagree with, and my major focus in the last few pages of the book and going forward is going to be to try to change that.
What was that psychological toll on you sort of as a youngster, and then moving on from there, having those incompatible goals at the time, public goal and private closeted life?
I don't remember it being a terrible toll explicitly, although it does seem clear to me as I look back now that it was having a negative impact that I didn't fully understand. At the time, frankly, there were other reasons why it seemed to me I probably could never get elected, one of which was, this is 1954, I'm Jewish, and one sign of great progress of America's ability to get better, to get closer to realizing our ideals, is that anti-Semitism, when I was first thinking about careers 60 years ago, was a significant impediment, and it isn't anymore. I mean, one of the things we have been able to do as a society is to diminish anti-Semitism to the point of almost zero as a career factor. Now, there are still some nuts out there, but it's a very different country. And I also thought I had the model by the time I'd gotten towards graduating from college, 1962, I had the model of the Kennedy administration, where a lot of people, professors, but not just professors, had gone into the Kennedy administration, not obviously as elected officials, but as appointees. It was professors, Arthur Schlesinger, John Kenneth Galbraith, Jerome Wiesner from MIT. So my sense of deprivation was lessened by the fact that I thought, you know what, I'll become a professor like these people, and I'll be in a university where privacy is more respected, where not being married with kids is not that much of an obstacle, although it's still obviously something advantageous to people. And I'll go to work for a president or a governor for a few years, and then I'll come back. So I thought that would be my career, and it was satisfying.
On the Jewish issue, there's a part in the book where you're telling Tip O'Neill, the speaker then, that you were going to come out. And he said, geez, that's too bad. You would have been the first Jewish speaker in his mind. Was that something that you would have wanted?
Oh, sure. And you know, and I appreciate that. And I didn't want to overdo it. He said you could have been. And that was flattering. Look, one of the things, you know, you have the things that happen to you in life, some of which are good, some of which are bad. It was luck that got me to be able to run for Congress. But once I did, I found, and this is to me one of the definitions of happiness, I found myself able to work at a job where I am good. And we're all a mix of good and bad traits. There were jobs where I was not very good. For example, being a scholar, I was supposed to be writing a PhD thesis, and I made a lot of coffee and sharpened a lot of pencils. That was in the old days. I wouldn't get anything done. I didn't have the power of concentration. But I was good at legislating, and so, yeah, it was very, it made me feel very good when Tip O'Neill said that. And sure, you know, people said, would you like to be the speaker? That's like asking someone, well, if you're a baseball player, is your ambition to be the best shortstop in AAA, or would you like to get to the majors? Right. The answer is, of course, you want to get to the top of your profession.
You survived the scandal that you had to face. How tough was that, and how did you manage to survive when most folks end up in politics, especially not surviving these scandals, other than Bill Clinton surviving his?
Two things. First of all, it was emotionally devastating to me because I, at that point, had come out publicly, and there's a confusion at time there that I always want to straighten out. I decided to tell people I was gay voluntarily 2.5 years before this guy surfaced. I wasn't forced into it. I did it voluntarily, and I'm very proud of that. 2.5 years later, a stupid thing I had done when I was still closeted, dealing with the pressures of being closeted. I mean, the problem with being a closeted public official is that you have emotional and physical needs that you want to meet, but it's hard to meet them in a healthy way. So I resorted to a prostitute, and then he was a clever guy. He saw my vulnerabilities emotionally, and played on them and pretended to want to have a closer relationship than we had. So I felt badly that I had first become the leading representative by coming out as a member of Congress of gay people, and then was tarnishing that. How I survived was very straightforward. I decided early on to tell the total truth. Well, the fact is that I had not done anything that misspent public money. I hadn't violated the law. I had been stupid, and I had paid personally to this guy long after there was a physical relationship. So I survived because I really did not break the law or even basic rules. I was found, I was reprimanded because I'd written a letter about him to a probation officer in which I lied about how I'd met him. I mean, I wasn't going to say that I met him by paying him for sex. So other than that, there wasn't anything wrong. But what basically I think helped me was I planted myself in front of the press for hours and said, ask me anything you want. And I think the mistake people make is sometimes to try and cover up. Lawyers, I've had lawyers. Lawyers do a very good job of keeping you out of jail, but they have no public relations instinct. So the lawyers always say, don't say anything, don't do this, don't do that. Here's the problem, and I'm going a little too long, but let me summarize. Dealing with a situation like that requires you to admit what you did wrong. But if you don't admit what you did wrong, people will then assume you did much more than that. In other words, there are always a cloud of accusations. And unless you're prepared to admit, yes, I did that, I shouldn't have done that. I hired this guy for sex, and I shouldn't have done that. If I wasn't prepared to deal with that forthrightly, I would never have been able to refute all the other wild accusations he had made because he was trying to extort me.
Really amazing. You just rarely hear this kind of honesty in these kinds of scandals, and it's just amazing because nobody else really, or most people don't really.
Well, it's hard. It's embarrassing, and the lawyers don't say it, and maybe they won't know. And I said, no, okay. It's typically the case that you are accused of doing worse things than you did.
By the way, that example you just said.
You can't refute that unless you admit what you did.
And what you just said was exactly an example you use of a, you don't name them, but I believe it's Gary Condit and Chandra Levy. But you said, look, the rumors are you might have killed her, and you're denying anything. Why don't you, and
you're absolutely right.
And that was exactly.
You're absolutely right.
Let me ask you this as we finish this kind of part of the show. We might think that Dodd-Frank would be the highlight and the most important thing you did in your career. What would you say is the most important thing that you did, contribution?
Yeah, frankly, I'm kind of reluctant to answer that because it becomes egotistical in every case. I will say there are other things which I'm very proud to have been able to do. The financial reform bill was very important, and I do feel good about that. There were some other areas, though, where I think, frankly, I might even have made more of a difference. That is, I had a big impact. I think it is the case that if I hadn't been the chairman with my leverage, we would not have had the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and Elizabeth Warren, I think, gives me credit for that. There are a couple other areas where I was making a fight that other people were ignoring. Trying to get rental housing built for low-income people has been a career-long issue. And I have not been as successful in that as I wanted, but I feel good about that. I think that's the missing piece. I did want to shut down bad loans to low-income people for housing to buy. But if you're going to keep people from buying housing, which you should if they can't afford it, then it seems to me you ought to give them rental housing. I also feel that my role on LGBT issues was important, and there were a couple of things that, frankly, I think I can take major credit for. Getting rid of the notion that we were security risks, which I got Bill Clinton to do. Ultimately, repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that took a while, but I think I'm very glad to be able to show in the book how Nancy Pelosi and I essentially were the major players in that. And then finally, when I came to Congress, there was a rule that said if you were gay, you couldn't be an immigrant to America. And I pretty much single-handedly got rid of that one.
All right. It's been great segment. Where would you assess the ownership of the problem? The government loosening of underwriting standards through several ways we'll talk about, or private risk-taking, that separation from risk and securitization. How would you allocate that?
The latter, the risk-taking. The federal government didn't so much loosen standards. And I've said this. I think the problem from the government standpoint was not so much that the government deregulated, but that it did not adopt new regulations where appropriate. We have this model in the financial world where the private sector innovates, and the role of the government is after the innovations have developed and they've sort of outgrown the existing regulatory regime, you come up with new regs. And the problem in the beginning of the 80s was we waited way too long to come up with new rules. And the single biggest change was exactly what you said about the economics of risk-taking. Before 1980, people who borrowed money had to pay back the person who had lent it to them. And if I have lent you money and I am waiting for you to pay me back, I'm going to be fairly careful about whether or not you can do that. That is, the lender exercised great scrutiny over the borrower. And then, because of information technology, which made it possible, and a flood of money that came in outside of the banking system from export-rich Asian countries, from oil-producing countries, etc., the new model became, increasingly after the 80s, you borrowed money from someone who then sold the loan to a third party. So the lender no longer had to worry about the borrower. And the incentive in the lending industry shifted from the quality of each loan to the quantity of loans. And the mistake the government made was not to recognize that and not to realize that absent this discipline that the lender would exercise because of her fear she wouldn't be repaid, then we needed to have a new set of rules. And it took us, frankly, until 2010 to get those rules adopted.
And, of course, on Wall Street, the ratings agencies were co-opted. Goldman Sachs did business.
Well, that's a very good point.
Selling it. You go ahead.
People made the mistake of thinking that the rating agencies could be the substitute for the lender-borrower discipline. In other words, they said, okay, well, it's true the lenders aren't being careful, but the rating agencies will step in, and they'll tell us whether these were good loans or not. And I really fault the rating agencies more than any other institution. They were making stuff up.
Okay,
let's giving ratings, and they had no basis for it whatsoever. So what happened was then bad loans were made. People then go out and buy them in securities. These securities fail. People who have insured the securities, like AIG, also fail. And that's so it does. But it all starts with those loans being made by lenders who don't have to worry about being repaid. And the credit agencies are then the major enablers, and I'm glad you brought that up.
That's right, and they were getting paid by the investment bank, so obviously they had a major conflict of interest. I want to go back to the government, though, for a second. On the underwriting standards and some other things, both Presidents George W. Bush and Clinton pushed to increase the percentage of home ownership, which obviously means moving down to subprime. Clinton had the Community Reinvestment Act, which I know you make a case in the book was not as bad as it appeared to be in the impact. The Commodity Futures Modernization Act was stifled by Robert Rubin, which meant derivatives stayed wild out there. Glass-Steagall went away, and the Fed and the SEC were basically asleep. Aren't those pretty big issues?
They are, but they all are what I said before. Not a weakening of standards, but a failure to adopt new ones. One correction I would make, and I think your list is an accurate one with one exception. The Community Reinvestment Act wasn't Bill Clinton's, it was Jimmy Carter's. The Community Reinvestment Act was passed in 1977, years before I got to Congress. And the point I make is this. The Community Reinvestment Act was passed when the great bulk of loans were still being made by lenders who expected to get repaid. So you really, and I have to say there's a broad consensus, including 3 of the 4 Republican appointees to the commission that looks into this. The former Republican head of the Congressional Budget Office, and Bill Thomas, who's the conservative Republican chairman of Ways and Means. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's any showing that this Community Reinvestment Act had a problem. As I said, it had been in existence for 30 years, for 20 years before it started. On the other hand, the Commodities Act, yes, and you're right that Bob Rubin was weak on this, but the prime mover there, let's be more bipartisan, was Senator Phil Gramm. That bill was passed. Bill Clinton was not for that. He had to sign it because it was part of an appropriations bill. But on what you say, I do agree that the problem was probably the government's fault, but it was inaction. One other difference I would have, and you're accurate, the Glass-Steagall was repealed. I voted against that, so I'm not justifying the repeal of Glass-Steagall. But it would not, I think, have stopped the crisis. It might have moderated some of its impact, although even that I don't think is the case. Because here's the problem. The loans we are talking about, the point you I think, correctly made, the question of how the lending business changed. Glass-Steagall wouldn't have affected that. Glass-Steagall would not have stopped derivatives from being sold, and Glass-Steagall would not have prevented securitization. Again, I think what we needed to do were newer regulations. And by the way, we did make one effort. In 1994, Congress, the last time it was Democratic for 12 years, did pass a law telling the Federal Reserve, and you were right about the Fed and the SEC being asleep. We told the Federal Reserve that we wanted them to begin to regulate these mortgages. And Alan Greenspan said, no, this is an interference with the market. I believe in the market, and he refused to do it.
All right, and let's go to the GSEs now, the Fannie and Freddie, which ended up holding 76% of the subprime, which to me would show lower underwriting standards. But the problem of the profit motive they had and the social goal motive, talk about Fannie and Freddie, and obviously you got some probably unfair blame for that, too, for pushing their growth.
Yeah, in the first place, I was not very much involved with Fannie and Freddie at first because my housing interest was affordable housing, essentially multifamily. The big change came in 1992. It was totally bipartisan. Some of the commentators forget this. It was an act passed by a Democratic Congress and signed by George H.W. Bush, which moved Fannie and Freddie more into a social direction. It is true, in 2003, inaccurately said that they were not a potential problem. I was focused, and I was quoted as saying I wanted to roll the dice for it. I did say that, but specifically with regard to multifamily subsidized housing. And by the way, that housing never failed. It was a single family that failed. But yeah, Fannie and Freddie were pushed to do more than they should have. And what happened was this. Again, they're not the prime culprit. They can't be. They never made loans. Fannie and Freddie never had, that wasn't their job. They literally never made a loan. What they did was to buy loans that other people had made. So the problem continued to be at its source, people making loans they shouldn't have made. But their ability to sell them to Fannie and Freddie encouraged them. And by 2005, it was clear to me that we should be making some changes. And again, things that people forget. The Republicans controlled both houses of Congress from 1995 through 2006. And it was under the Republicans, the bill that expanded Fannie and Freddie had been passed in 92. By the time it became clear that there were a problem, the Republicans were in power, and it was the Republicans who failed to adopt things. And as Hank Paulson, Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, last one mentions in his book, when he became Secretary of the Treasury, he called me because it looked like I was going to become the chairman of the committee in 2007, and we began to work together. So it was in 2007, when the Democrats came back to power, that we finally acted about Fannie and Freddie.
This has been a great interview. We really appreciate the time. I want to thank Barney Frank, former congressman. His book, Frank, A Life in Politics, From the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. And, of course, it is very frank, published by FSG. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks to our national audience. We'll see you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.